I'm Lynda Wright. We are at Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, Virginia on October the 24th, 2007.
I'm Greg Daugherty. I'm professor of classics. I came here in 1976. And this is my colleague, Tom Porter.
I'm Tom Porter. I'm chairman of the history department, also work in Asian studies, and have been at the college since really January of 1974, although my first class was in February. I received my doctorate in a time when there weren't very many jobs, and in mid-year I talked to an alumnus of the college who was a historian. His name's Emory Evans, and he told me he'd gone to this little school in Virginia and they had an opening, and it was a thoroughly silly job to apply for because it was a sabbatical replacement. Bill Reinhardt was going to India on a Fulbright scholarship to do research, and they needed someone that would work for 9 months and span 2 academic years, so that you were, in effect, cutting yourself out of employment. But it was one of only 2 jobs that year that seemed even remotely possible to apply for, so I did. I came down in December at Christmas break. There had been 12 inches of snow, so James Scanlon immediately turned the car keys over to me and said, "You come from Chicago, you drive." And I did. It was Christmas break, so the students were mostly gone. We ate a Sunday meal in the dining hall, which consisted of very small crumbs of potato chips and cold-cut sandwiches. It was very elegant, not very fancy surroundings. And I remember having lunch in a Quonset hut they called the CX. It's behind the building that's now the Brown Center. But it was cozy. People were very friendly. George Oliver, James Scanlon, Jerry Bledsoe were the people who interviewed me. And I didn't have to give a lecture. I was invited over to the Bledsoes for dinner to be interviewed, and there was a round of drinks. And by the time they got around to asking me questions, it was a very cozy atmosphere, so I'm not sure they ever interviewed me at all. But I liked them, and they seemed to like me and offered me the position. And my wife and I left the Chicago area in January with 2 cats and about 15 plants in the back of our car in minus 20 degree temperatures. It never got above zero the rest of that winter, and we thought we'd died and gone to heaven. It was so warm and comfortable. I got my garden in March. The campus was essentially the same as it is now, except it was totally different. The contradiction in that is simply that it was less well kept, fewer buildings, smaller student body, less crowded.
Kind of shabby.
Yeah, actually it was. Greg just said it was a little shabby, and it had that feel to it. It was a small southern town at the time. Subsequently, a lot of other people besides myself moved in who were northerners, and the environment has changed, but it really was a small southern town, and exciting invitation was Sunday afternoon after church to go over to Dr. Maybury's and have sandwiches with the crust cut off and a cup of tea that you balanced on your lap. And it was a very white, small town environment, which I'd had some experience with in my own life, but was very, very foreign to my wife, who was Greek and grew up in Chicago. I remember coming home the first week we moved into her house, coming home one day, and she was in tears. She said, "I can't understand anybody. I've called repairmen, I've talked to people on the phone, and they all speak in languages I do not understand." And we laughed over it after a while, but it was just accents, rural white and black, urban white and black, all kinds of accents that she was not used to, and just a small town kind of quality that she'd never experienced. I'll trying to remember, Greg, when did you arrive at college?
I came in 76 in September, starting out the year. That I had kind of a similar hiring experience. Mine was kind of accidental too, because I was finishing my dissertation. I hadn't finished it, and so I applied for jobs, and I'd had a couple of interviews in the American Philological Association meeting, including one with Dan McCaffrey, which was actually in the hallway between other interviews, because a professor of mine from the University of Richmond, which is where I went to undergraduate school, had badgered him into interviewing me. I wasn't on his schedule, so we just, in passing, had a little conversation. He was, I remember Dan was very nervous because that was his first year. In fact, it was his first semester at Randolph-Macon. He hadn't been renewed for the next year because that didn't happen until the spring. And he was job hunting at the same time. In fact, we only managed to talk to one another because we were waiting for the same interview at another place. So we had a conversation, and subsequently I got a letter saying that thanks, but no thanks. I'm not interested. They had hired someone else. And I wasn't really expecting to get a job because I hadn't finished my dissertation, and I was doing it just for the practice of interviewing and so forth, and hoping I would get something because I didn't have any other way of supporting myself that next semester. But went through the process. I actually did get one other job offer. It was in Omaha, and I got it after I'd accepted the offer at Randolph-Macon. But at the end of May, I got a phone call, and it appears that the person who had been hired for the job, and whose name was already printed in the schedule, which caused me some problems in September, had backed out and had taken a job at UVA, where subsequently he was denied tenure. So there's certain poetry in that. And they needed someone at the last minute. It was the last day. They asked me to come up. And back in those days, they would only pay half your travel expenses if you didn't get the job, which always seemed to me the reverse. The people who didn't get the job needed the expenses. So I couldn't fly. It was way too expensive if I was only going to get half of it back. So I drove from Nashville, Tennessee to Richmond, which I did, I think, in one day, because I couldn't afford to stay anywhere. It was, and then I stayed with some people that I knew from when I was an undergraduate. Actually, someone I'd known when my father was in the Air Force. And I came up for an interview, and it was very pleasant. It was the last day of exams, and I met with Dan, and we talked about what we would do. He was in the process of revising the department curriculum because it had been what had been left by Robert Epps Jones. He said he had asked Robert Epps Jones what was the difference between the Latin courses that he taught, and he said, well, we read different works of Cicero. We wanted to broaden things. We talked about it and found we actually had a lot in common, and we had some similar ideas. And so I was thinking that this would be a really nice place to work, because while we were interviewing, Dan was giving an exam, and students came in and asked him questions, and I thought it was a friendly, kind of student-friendly environment. It looked like an interesting place. It was hot as hell, though, because Haley Hall was not air-conditioned in those days, and it's the end of May. It was blazing hot in that building. But I had a similar experience, except I got to go to the Holiday Inn for lunch.
Luxury.
Yes, where the dean ordered a club salad, so I ordered the same thing. not realizing that you don't actually get to eat anything when you're in a job interview. I have trouble remembering who was there. I know that Dick Hasker was there, who was in English department, but he was the acting chair of classics because the senior person had been denied tenure. Louis Hames, who taught Greek, and I was to replace him. He was still around, but the chairmanship had been taken over by Dick Hasker. He was there, and Howard Davis, the dean, and there were a couple of other people, but I can't really remember exactly who was there. We went out to lunch, had a nice conversation. Had a conversation with Howard Davis, whom I liked very much, because he, I remember at one point, he claims he never did this. We were having a conversation about the job, during which time I never asked what the salary was, because I wish I had. Maybe I would have asked for more, because it wasn't very much in those days. And at one point he leaned back and put his fingers together like he always did and said, "Now let me speak to you of deanly things," and then did the boilerplate about contracts and so forth. And I was just sort of amazed. He was this fatherly figure who had this very deep. He just looked like a dean out of some Goodbye, Mr. Chips kind of movie. It just felt really comfortable. So then I left, having gotten my hair cut and wearing a blue polyester suit that my brother had given me, the only suit I had, and the only haircut I'd had in about 12 months, since my hair was actually down to my shoulders. I'd really cleaned up well, I think. And I got in the car and drove back, and took some time, stopped off to see someone. So it was like 2 days later when I got back, and they've been frantically trying to call me to offer me the job while I was still in town. So I didn't get to go find an apartment or anything like that while I was there. But I kind of backed into the job. Somebody else had the job, and I got it because I was available. And I had that sort of chance interview with Dan, so it worked out pretty well. So I don't think I was supposed to be here.
You weren't supposed to, but you still are, and that's my situation. As I said, I was hired on a sabbatical replacement for 9 months, but 34 years later, I'm still here. I was hired, and Stella and I moved back, and during that first spring that I taught, a man named Jerry Bledsoe, who had helped organize the collective bargaining strike, which I found out had occurred in the year before I came, had taken a job with the AAUP as an organizer and moved to Washington. I really liked Jerry and his wife Penny. She was a Spanish teacher here. And was sad to see them go, but it gave me a job. Turned out that the dean later told me that they kind of knew Jerry was going, and George Oliver and Howard Davis both said it at different times, but they just didn't want to tell me in case something should happen. So they kind of knew I was being hired for longer term, but I didn't. But once I was here and settled in and got established, we came to enjoy it. We rented a house out in the country, which we ultimately bought. At that time, out in the country was 3 miles away. I now call it suburban Ashland because it's less country and more suburb. The building we taught in was Fox Hall, and it didn't have air conditioning, as Greg mentioned about Haley. It did have windows which were pretty much air conditioned. That is, the wind would blow through them. You had to stuff paper towels, and we use duct tape now. That hasn't changed, except they use duct tape. I had a luxurious office. It was probably about 5 just 5.5 feet wide. You could a desk and a chair, and I had just enough room to get in and out of the chair. That was it. I had one bookcase and one student chair. If a second student came, they had to stand out in the hallway. After Jerry left, then I got his office, which was a huge space. It wasn't very attractive. It wasn't the treasurer at the time, named Don Reed, was a retired supply captain from the Army, and he... Navy, I'm sorry. Yes, you're right, Navy. And he painted the whole college in Navy surplus green, which had a kind of sickly quality to it, but it was cheap and it covered everything. I remember several years later, a young woman was hired in economics, and in the second floor of Fox Hall, it was 4 historians and the full economics department. And she was going to be the business department, and she wanted to paint her door green, and afraid our Captain Reed just about turned green at the very thought of adding color or anything unusual to the building. We worked it out. Don turned out to be a very nice man once he realized that you actually cared about what you did and about the college, and we got along. He was a rock-solid Republican, and I teased him endlessly about that and got good in return. The classrooms were all across the hall in Fox, and we had a small classroom and a large. There's nothing like seminars rooms in those days because you were expected to lecture. We had a blackboard, which was the only teaching aid that God intended. I remember going into this storeroom that I found and dragging out a film projector. Now, I'm talking about film, 16 millimeter, and this projector belonged in the Smithsonian. It was old at that point, and no one in the department could figure out why anybody would want to show a film unless they didn't have their lecture prepared for that day. The idea of teaching aids and media were foreign, so I was teased endlessly about actually showing movies and films in class. Not first-run Hollywood films, to be sure, but anything I could find in the library or the consortium, which was a collection of Richmond area libraries that would loan us material, and the Virginia Museum that also would loan us material. We stayed in Fox Hall, and I was in that office and classrooms till 1987 when History Department moved to Wash Frank Hall, which was a derelict building up until that time, from the mid-60s until 87, when it was renovated by a rather substantial gift to the college by the, her name was Bunny Mellon. She was a Lambert by birth, and she was related to a student who'd helped to raise the money to build the building back in the 1860s, early 70s, and we were given very nice offices, and of course the jealous comments and snide remarks from the rest of the faculty have continued about how we were favored, but we moved from the center of campus off to the fringe, far away, I don't know, a few hundred yards farther than everybody else, which put us on the edge of the campus and out of the mainstream. So life changed a bit after that in terms of the activities. History used to be kind of a center for Friday afternoon parties, and George Oliver would make whiskey sours and popcorn, and we would get together and socialize after the classes were over. It was really quite a nice group of people from across the campus in all disciplines, and it was a good social occasion. We enjoyed it. By 5:30, we would break up and go off on our own business.
Yeah, there was a lot more of that when we were, during the first couple of years we were here. We would do things over in Haley Hall, too, which is where I was located. I followed Tom into Fox Hall. In fact, I have his old desk, including the burn stains from where you put your teapot down. Frank Hayek did that? Okay.
Sabbatical, I had to have a replacement, and we had a man named Frank Hayek. When I came back, he had damaged my desk. I was furious.
Well, I've got the damaged desk. So he got the nice furniture over in the new Wash Frank Hall, and we got all of the leftover stuff.
I like the old desk better than the new one, but they wouldn't let me take it.
Well, actually, I like it fine. I can't see the top of it because of all my junk, but it's and the doors stick.
You can't see the legs of it for all your junk.
That's true. That's true. But that's all the essential stuff. Everyone needs Cleopatra action figures. But yeah, I was in Haley Hall for 12 years when I first came, and used to complain about the lack of air conditioning because it really was awfully hot in there. Mainly because the first 2 summers I was here, I was finishing my dissertation and doing it without any air conditioning. But every honors convocation had given an award named for Joseph Boyd Haley, who was a Greek professor. And when I would do it, I would mention that Haley Hall was the only unair-conditioned classroom building on campus. Because Fox Hall had air conditioning in the offices at that time, not in the classrooms, but we had none. So I was always trying to rub that in. It was pretty Spartan. We didn't have much there. It was just all blackboards. We did have the Fitzgerald room, which had a film projector in it, which we used all the time. And later on, it got the first VCR I ever saw, big 3/4-inch thing that Bruce Unger would come over to tape things for his classes. I don't know what he ever did with them, but he was always over there taping TV shows off of PBS. But we didn't have anything. In fact, I had to go buy a slide projector myself so that we'd have one to use in the department in classes. We eventually got one, but it took a long time to get it approved. So I went out and bought my own. I still have that one, and in fact, we still have many of the slide projectors. But yeah, it was just blackboards and desks and maps. We did have maps. Which are nice things to have around. But we also did there was a lot more gathering of people to socialize. I had a coffee pot in my office, and so everybody in the building would stop by at one point or another for coffee. And then we go over to George's office for whiskey sours.
Mentioning the equipment, my first elected committee assignment was Resources and Planning Committee. When I came, I mentioned there'd been a collective bargaining conflict because it turned out that the college was in dreadful financial shape in the 1970s. They'd built a science building, and they'd built some other buildings, a dorm, and they
financed them on a MasterCard.
Yeah, it was a rather large debt. They were in trouble with the accrediting agency and had barely passed. And, of course, they didn't tell me any of that at the time of the hiring, only once I was safely there and without any way to get another job. But there was virtually no budget for equipment. There'd been a reorganization of the governance system. They'd created some 6 official committees. Resources and Plans allocated money for departmental budgets and capital purchases, except there was no capital budget. So during that first year, a man named Wade Temple, who was a physicist, was chairman, and he was trying to get the president to include $50,000 a year for 5 years that would go towards the purchase of capital equipment. And it was actually successful. It was agreed on, put into the campaign, and the money was raised. After a year, I was elected chairman of the committee, which gives you an idea how important everyone thought Resources and Plans was. I was untenured and had only been there a year and a half by then. But over the next 3 years, we managed to get computing on the college agenda, and actually in the next campaign, we're able to begin replacing both the college's central computer. They had a central computer that ran batch jobs, and it was really an industrial machine that had run an assembly line, and they had adapted it. But we got a NSF grant, and we replaced it, and we bought the first college Apple computer, first laptop, and then we got a grant to subsidize faculty in buying laptops. This was about 1980. So the educational resources didn't exactly start flowing in, but they did start dribbling into people's hands. We had a fancy science building without equipment, and that was slowly remedied as well. It was a college without much in the way of resources and a Methodist mentality that said, we're privileged to work here and we can make do, so don't rock the boat and don't ask for anything, which was part of the problem. As older faculty were replaced, some of us came in with a different attitude from different parts of the country with graduate school experiences that suggested we really ought to have a few bits of equipment, and there were things we could do. But it was a difficult time. Looking back, it was also, because we were young, a good time and a lot of fun and satisfying because everything you did was new.
Yeah, and it was, not only was it new, but it was, it felt like I belonged to something when it first came. There was a sense of collegiality. Most people lived nearby, so if something was going on, most of the faculty would show up for it. Faculty meetings took place at night, which would never happen now. Because it was fairly convenient for most people just to stay around for an evening faculty meeting, and they didn't have a cap to them, so they would go on to ungodly hours. One of them went on till 11 o'clock at night. I think some even went on later, but I don't remember anything later than that. But it was kind of fun. They would start at 7:30, and in Haley Hall, people would get together and go over to the Holiday Inn to have dinner, which is the only place to eat in those days. There was, other than a couple of fast food places, there really wasn't anything in Ashland then. But also it had a bar, the only bar in town. And maybe my memories of faculty meetings being pleasant were colored by the fact that we usually had 2 martinis before we headed over there. But it was... went with a couple of people from the English department, and it was a very amiable kind of environment. We had lots of disagreements about lots of different things, but everybody kind of approached it as they were all part of the same team, and that we shared a lot of values, academic rigor. I think kind of ironic that the people who were supervising me in the early days were very concerned that I wasn't going to be tough enough. I wasn't going to be rigorous enough. And I think at the time that the two of us were probably considered the easy ones in the area, and now we're the tough guys. I don't think we've changed a whole lot, but there was kind of there was a culture to the college, and everybody knew what the values were. Everybody there was because they wanted to teach. You had to be. You're teaching 9 courses per year. It was quite a heavy teaching load. And the second year I was there, I was defending my dissertation. I had 9 regular courses. I had 50 freshman advisees, and I was teaching 2 independent studies. I honestly don't know how I survived the year, but I did. And I remember it being one of the happiest years of my life.
I don't miss the 9-course teaching load, but I do remember it because I had to create extra courses. I was hired for 7 courses, the 313, 3 in fall, January term, which was a different type of course at that time. It was colloquy, and students were required to take 4 of them to graduate, and then 3 courses in the spring. And then because of finances, we went up to 9 courses. eventually down to 8, and then back to 7 in the 1980s. But as Greg said, there was times when I had 40, 50 advisees, and you managed to get it all done, but it did take its toll out of things which nowadays are more highly rated, publications, professional activity. You had to bend somewhere, and those were usually the areas. There wasn't much in the way of travel money. There wasn't much support. I remember when I was hired, I asked if professional activity was expected, and the dean, Howard Davis, said, well, we certainly wouldn't hold it against you, but I can't give you much support, and you'll have to do that after you do your teaching. That's extra. That's not why you're being hired here. That's not the basic purpose of the college. The 70s were a difficult time. We had President Luther Wright, who had been less than successful as a fundraiser and was a very conservative man. I know he was very concerned because of the addition of women in 1971, that men and women were visiting each other, quote unquote visiting, in their respective dormitories, and that was something that worried him. He said he was afraid the women would lose their identities, and I'm pretty sure that did go on from what the students have told me at that time. He finally left the college in 1979, and Lynda Payne was hired. I remember during his interviews, one of the most frequently asked questions was whether he and his wife drank, because it was primarily dry campus from the president's perspective. All the students were notorious for their drinking, and more than one faculty member did as well, as I recall. But the general atmosphere loosened up a bit. I don't know that it got better, but it did change, and the college took a greater interest in professional activity, got some gifts for endowments to subsidize travel and attendance at meetings, and really began to change in a number of ways in the 1980s with President Payne's arrival.
Yeah, that was sort of a big difference when that changed after I came with the change in deans. One big lesson to me was that when the dean leaves, all the rules change. Howard Davis had said to me in that interview that I talked about that he didn't care if I ever published anything. As soon as he left, that changed, and people who were hired after that had different expectations, and the expectations keep going up. We've always insisted that teaching is primary, but it's not quite the same culture that had been originally. I think that was not only was the primary job, it was the only job that we were expected to do. And I rather liked that, because I'd done some teaching in graduate school, but when I did it, I found that I really enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed being in the classroom. I was pretty good at it. And I liked the fact that I was at a place that valued that. And I didn't know that could be changed. And that came as a blinding revelation to me when the first change in dean and president came, to find out that the college culture that Dick Hasker had so patiently explained to me really wasn't the same thing. And also that people who had held all the power when I first came, when the dean changed, no longer held it. And that was a hard lesson to learn, but an important one, and one that is of which I am being reminded in current days.
Howard Davis left the deanship in 1977, was replaced by a man named Elton Hendricks, who come from South Carolina. I was a physicist, and Elton was dean until 1983, when he went off to become a president of a college in Wesleyan, Methodist College in North Carolina. And he's still there. He's done a marvelous job of building up a college from almost scratch, and I've stayed in touch with him. He was a very nice man, very supportive of me. He helped me in 1980 to apply for a American Council on Education fellowship, which is like an administrative internship. Turned out that President Payne had spent some time there and knew the people, so I was very much in their debt for opening up that possibility to me. I spent a year as administrative assistant to President Payne and Dean Hendricks at the college, but I also spent time at VCU getting acquainted with the university and how it operated. And 2 years later, in 83, August of 83, Elton Hendricks resigned, much to the surprise of most of us, and I ended up being appointed the acting dean for a year. That was really a growing experience, an exciting opportunity for me. It was understood, it was a condition of employment that I couldn't be a candidate for dean. They wanted to hire someone from outside and change the college. Change is always an interesting word. I don't think anybody was quite sure what they wanted to change to, and that's usually the case, but they knew that it wanted to be different. But I served under Jerry Garris then for the next 7 years as the first associate dean of the college. I always kept a hand in teaching. I always taught at least one course, usually one course a semester, so that I had contact with reality. I felt that was very necessary, and there were plenty of role models. Ira Andrews was dean of students, but he always taught, and Jerry Garris taught one course a year, as Elton Hendricks had. And it kept us in touch. It kept us in touch with the students and with the experiences of other faculty, so that you knew what your colleagues were going through, and you had a more patient perspective, a more enlightened perspective as to what their needs were, what the new crop of students were. Of course, every year we were told by admissions that they were best students that had ever been, with the highest scores and glowing reports, and you needed to keep that focus on reality. I don't think the admissions distorted, but they told us what they believed to be true, and most of us believe that there were changes in the student body over time. It's very hard to document, hard to keep a clear perspective because it runs together. You forget what you experienced. The most recent set of really dreadful papers seems much worse than you've ever seen before, but in reality it isn't. But I think there was a change in the student body and in the expectations over time. It's just a very hard thing to document. Following the earlier line of conversation, I also then in 1990 was given the position, asked to take the position of Dean of Institutional Planning. George Oliver referred to me as the DIP, D-I-P, Dean of Institutional Planning. But then George had always been a thorn in my side and a great support and mentor. When I was first made acting dean, I was teaching in the mornings, and I'd go to the Peel Hall in the afternoons, and George would approach me as I would be getting out of my office and ready to leave. He said, "Porter, you're fired. Get out of here." And so I'd go across the campus, the quad to Peel Hall, and I'd get on the phone. I'd call back and say, "Oliver, this is Dean Porter calling. You're fired. Pack up and get out." And he loved that joke. We just played that game over and over for years. We still do once in a while, even though George is now retired. He'll laugh about the old times. He was a good mentor, a good supporter of the people under him. He helped them in every way he could to get tenure and to do their professional work and to solve any problems they had with the administration or with the students. I remember when I was still untenured, Greg had mentioned earlier that we were always thought to be much too easy. The senior faculty knew they were much harder. And one year in the review process, I was criticized by someone outside the department that I gave a high grade in the January colloquy to a student that he knew what he had taught, and he knew he wasn't any good. And turned out that my average grade for all my courses was 0.02% off of the college average. But I was too easy, so it was above instead of below, and which would have been okay. Those are little memories that stick in your mind, but looking back, they turn out to be not very important, but just kind of markers along the way of the hurdles you had to jump and the attitudes that people develop. The college has certainly changed. The campus has certainly changed over the years. More buildings and larger student body, more faculty, and way more administrators than we ever had before.
It always seemed to me the student body was more affluent than it was when we first came here. There was a whole lot more financial aid. I remember there was one year when a lot of my best students just didn't come back. And it was the year that, I think it was the year Reagan changed or eliminated federal aid to college students in the early 80s, because I had several really, really good students who just didn't come back to the college, and for financial reasons, because they didn't have the financial aid that they'd had before. And that's when I first noticed that things were changing. But I wasn't surprised. We were doing for our assessment review, and I was going back through and looking at some old exams and grades from former students, and I looked back at some of the best students that I had from the early days and noticed that I gave them B's, and I read the paper and thought, my God, this was a B. It was one of the things that I had trouble adjusting to was the insistence on standards. Especially Dick Hasker, who was my chair the first year I was there, and then was always in the building, always very concerned with these things. It kind of bothered me at first because the standards I was using were higher than the ones that were applied to me when I was at the University of Richmond only a few years before that, and given our institutional inferiority complex, everyone believed that things were tougher and the students were better at the University of Richmond, and I was sort of living proof that wasn't true. I was Phi Beta Kappa student there, and I never had to do the kind of work that I was asking of my students, but they were doing it, so I guess I bought into the idea of having very high standards and expecting the students to rise to it. But I find it a little ironic that my degree of rigor was questioned the first couple of years I was here, and that was...
You gave B's. You gave B's. What can I say?
That's
true. The
true.
history department didn't do that.
Right. No one ever got a B in the history department, but it's... But those were people I actually did look to for things. Dick Hasker, who's still around, and Bob Offenbacher, Bernal Panel, who's died, and Bob Hopkins, who was the registrar, and George Oliver. There used to always be a time when faculty would come over and have coffee in the CX. I guess it's because it was new then, or coffee was cheap. But every morning, middle of the morning, everybody would gather over there, and I found that these people really were happy to give advice or tell you why things were done. You know, why did we have 60-minute classes? Everybody else in the world has 50-minute classes, and all you had to do was ask one question like that, and the hour was filled, because each one of them would then weigh in on the reasons why and how back in 1959, one student had gotten away with something, and so we have a rule. We had a rule against that. But I really enjoyed listening to those guys. I didn't always do everything that they said, but they were. That was sort of a tutoring session for young faculty. Doesn't really exist anymore, and I know since we're now the old farts, nobody asks us any questions. It's a very different kind of environment than it was in the old days. Well, I never was a dean, but I started the summer school. I was the first. We had a summer school before that. I started the one that we currently have. I was the first director of it. And what? Yeah, I started the honors program. I was the first director. I was the chair of the committee that put it all together. And I was also chair of the committee that got rid of the honor code and instituted the academic integrity code. It was a period there, and I think that when there was a job like that to be done, there were some people who got tapped to do it. I think I was actually untenured when I did most of these things. I kind of surprised. I agreed to it, but it was kind of fun to be part of the process to developing things for the college. I was on the committee that instituted the curricular change in the 80s. So was part of things that were going on. I don't think that's true anymore. There's another generation, but that's because deans changed. When Elton Hendricks was here, he looked a new group of people, and it took me years later to realize I